Where'd they take these shots?
Seems like they were spending a lot of their time in a little place northeast of their camp, about 5 or 6 miles.
What's that?
It looks like something buried under the ice.
John Carpenter's The Thing is easily one of the greatest horror films ever made. The chronicled demise of Arctic Outpost 31 under the siege of a shape-shifting alien may not have captured the proper audience at its debut, but it has become one of the most widely cited cornerstones of both the sci-fi and horror genres, and its influence is undeniable. Though the film owes its status to a confluence of factors, the excellent direction, focused writing, tense cinematography, brisk pacing, special effects that were, for the time, cutting edge, and a talented cast and crew, it is most remembered for its atmosphere of paranoia and dread, and its iconic, ambiguous ending. Not long ago, I took my fiancée to see a showing of the film after learning that she'd never seen it, and afterward, we fell down a rabbit hole of watching these seemingly endless theories about the thing's ending. Despite some extra textual content, Carpenter himself has never confirmed a definitive answer, though has hinted there could be one, which has only intensified speculation. Kurt Russell has further detailed in interviews how he and Carpenter worked with the cast to devise an ending that was intentionally vague. As a result, there's no shortage of ideas, ranging from straightforward to complex, with some even pushing the limits of credulity. If you want to see what I'm talking about, there is a tremendous effort post by Poltergeist, clocking in at just over 2 hours, summarizing some, though not all, of the prevailing theories. However, in my travails, I came across a video titled "MacReady is the Thing and I Can Prove It" by Too Dim Media. In it, the presenter spends a little over half an hour explaining why MacReady is the thing by the film's end. He then made a response video over 40 minutes long to the substantial pushback he received in his comments. Despite the considerable length and a commendable effort to substantiate his claims, I found his thesis unconvincing. But that got me thinking. Too Dim and I, along with countless others, all have the same information. So how did we arrive at different conclusions, especially considering MacReady is obviously not the thing? And if you need some convincing, I can demonstrate. But first, let's set the stage. The Thing is a masterstroke in storytelling, in large part because of Carpenter's efficiency, intentionality, and economy. There are no wasted scenes, no shoe leather, and almost no downtime, except for those moments used to highlight the isolation of the outpost or to give us some minor character insights. The film is lean, fast, and purposeful. But one of the most interesting aspects is that Carpenter front-loads everything we need to know about MacReady and foreshadows the end of the film in one scene. MacReady is introduced playing against the chess wizard. At first, Mac gloats smugly that the machine is about to lose. In fact, it's one of the few times we see him smile. However, he's exposed himself due to a blind spot, and the machine checkmates him.
Checkmate.
In response, he sarcastically refers to the computer as a
cheating bitch,
and pours his drink into the chassis, shorting the motherboard, which some might characterize as an overreaction. Too Dim highlighted this scene as well, but misunderstood its purpose. While the scene may highlight his intelligence, it isn't meant to paint him as a grand strategist. After all, he loses. Its sole purpose is to show us that while he may be cool, calm, and collected, MacReady is also a sore loser. His reaction to the chess wizard is equivalent to someone flipping the board after losing Monopoly. They don't care about winning anymore, they'd rather destroy everything out of frustration. In Mac's case, if he can't win, you won't either. His unwillingness to accept a loss is core to his character and informs the trajectory of the film's ending, with his humorous overreaction giving us a hint about what to watch for. While MacReady does his best to outplay the thing, attempting to kill it or at least contain it, his attempts are constantly stymied as the alien plays by a different set of rules entirely. It's more ruthless and calculating, with abilities, ambitions, and a complex intellect that humans don't possess. Like the chess wizard, it's seemingly built to do one thing: win. We watch as Mac continually pivots, more and more frantic, with fewer and fewer victory options, culminating in his blowing up the alien ship, nearly at the cost of his own life. Ultimately, all the characters come up short, ostensibly leaving only one alive. Of course, which one is the crux of the debate. Despite being roughly 2 minutes of screen time, the exchange between Childs and MacReady is the most widely dissected, but there's a fair amount of nuance in the scene that can be overlooked. While most debate the drink MacReady gives to Childs, illumination in the eyes, or a lack of breath in the cold, this is ultimately a distraction, and whether there's alcohol or gasoline in the bottle or a hidden flamethrower is irrelevant. The preceding conversation is actually what's important. When approached by Childs, the worn-out and injured MacReady seems to react with resignation. Childs has the drop on him, a flamethrower pointed in his direction, and Mac is in a position of weakness. Like the chess wizard in the beginning, Thing Childs wasn't something he anticipated, a critical blind spot and a potential checkmate. But Childs doesn't fry MacReady. Instead, he sits down to talk because he, the Thing, needs information. He's trying to figure out his next move because the base and his craft are destroyed, leaving no visible way out. Conspicuously, Thing Childs never even asks Mac if he's okay or what happened. Given the giant explosion, you'd think he'd be mildly curious. Instead, he opens with a question about how many others may have survived.
You the only one who made it?
The Thing is strategizing and evaluating the landscape, determining how many more it will contend against. Thing Childs next observes that the fire will go out soon, and they'll freeze. As an audience, we have reason to suspect this will send him back into hibernation, something we believe the alien was trying to avoid. He's also saying this in an attempt to pressure Mac to act. The Thing knows it's out of options. When Thing Childs asks Mac,
How will we make it?
he's looking for Mac to reveal some escape plan that he can use to his advantage. A salvaged radio, a spare helicopter, a nearby base. Anything to get away. Mac, however, responds,
Maybe we should.
and that's it. That's the board flip. That's Mac pouring alcohol into the chess wizard. That's how you know that MacReady is still human. He doesn't care about beating the Thing anymore. He knows he can't. Instead, he'd rather they both lose. This is the other time we see MacReady smile, subtly and thematically echoing his previous taunt to the chess wizard.
Poor baby, you're starting to lose it, aren't you?
In fact, in a dark but comedic twist, Mac shares a drink with the Thing, echoing how he shared one with the chess wizard. And although it is a motivating factor, I don't believe we can attribute this reaction simply to altruism or a desire to save humanity explicitly. Instead, exhausted, injured, and frustrated, MacReady will take the Thing with him, even if only temporarily. This isn't just a strategic move, it's a personal slight. He may lose, but the Thing will not get to enjoy victory, because the Thing is a cheating bitch, and there's only one way to deal with those. Carpenter provides us with two thematically linked bookends. The story is now brought full circle. He tells us who MacReady is, and then creates a through line linking his behavior in the beginning to his behavior at the end. This consistency of character can give us confidence that he's still human. Now, if you heard all this and you thought it was a good theory, well, thanks. But if you heard all this and you thought it was bunk, you're right. I don't know if I'm even convinced by what I said. I'm more than happy to concede that every theory, no matter how well crafted, is little more than fanciful speculation. That's part of this film's brilliance. Cultivating an intense atmosphere of paranoia can cause us to lose perspective. When faced with the incomprehensible, we can overwhelm ourselves with endless possibilities about what might be. A simple exercise attempting to discern the ending can spiral, turning into theories about the alien or the outpost crew that, while interesting, aren't always borne out by the context of what's happening on screen, and get us no closer to an answer. That's a core element of cosmic horror in general. No matter what you think you know, you don't. And whatever you do know is so incomplete and insignificant that you may as well not know. I'm personally in Kurt Russell's camp and think that looking for any explicit clues is a fool's errand because they aren't there. Even if there's a definitive answer, our frame of reference is limited to whatever happens in camera, too minuscule to ever arrive at a satisfying consensus. And for every theory that definitively proves one angle, another can refute it. There's a futility in attempting to analyze the film's ending with the supposition that it has a concrete answer. So if every theory is equally valid or invalid, why bother with any analysis? Because we must contend with the rabbit duck. The rabbit duck is an ambiguous image that, as the name suggests, allows viewers to see a rabbit or a duck. Initially published in a German magazine as a joke, this image has since been used in theoretical exercises and to relate complex philosophical concepts. You may have seen other versions of this image. Common ones include the old woman young princess, the upside down stairs, or the cup between faces. No matter which one you've seen, these images can help us reflect on how we perceive and interpret. When you looked at this image, you likely saw one of two things immediately: the rabbit or the duck. To see the other image requires us to shift our perspective and make concessions regarding our cognitive processes. We may not even be convinced that the duck or the rabbit are necessarily there, or at least are not as apparent as what we saw, but we can, nonetheless, see how a person could perceive that image. Like the rabbit duck, the thing embodies an approach to art referred to as the aim at ambiguity, where an artistic piece is deliberately structured to invite multiple interpretations. Elements that are unclear, unresolved, or even contradictory prompt audiences to engage with the content to draw their own conclusions or meaning. Because of its intentional ambiguity, the thing has the potential to operate as a layered meta-narrative that can reveal a great deal to the audience, about the audience, and ask us to examine our method of filtering and evaluating information based on the conclusions we draw. What you think about the ending, or whether you think about it at all, is a good place for self-reflection. As a result, I find that the theories or subsequent disagreements are less interesting, and instead became fascinated by the nature of our disagreement because it's clear we all have different starting points and methodologies that come into play long before making our conclusions. Ludwig Wittgenstein used the image of the rabbit duck in his work Philosophical Investigations to describe two different ways of seeing that and seeing as. Keeping it to broad strokes for the purposes of this video, Wittgenstein conceived of seeing that as a more straightforward type of perception, which involved recognizing facts about what is manifestly visible without a need for interpretive choice. Conversely, seeing as refers to perception that involves interpretation. To see something as something else required the application of some conceptual framework or an interpretive lens. To Wittgenstein, there was an element of choice or a shift in perspective that would allow us to interpret the image in one way or another. Rather than changing sensory input, seeing as meant a change in how the mind organizes and gives meaning to that input. This made seeing as an active form of cognitive perception. Returning to the rabbit duck, Wittgenstein saw this as an exercise of seeing as, where the viewer had to choose to see the image of the rabbit or the duck. Wittgenstein used this to illustrate that perception was not purely passive, but rather influenced by our unique mental frameworks. Richard Wollheim later refined this philosophical framework and modified seeing as to seeing in. In Essay 5 of Art and Its Objects, Wollheim contended that seeing as was inadequate, or at the very least, a less rigorous descriptor for the cognitive processes which were occurring when interacting with art, and specifically pictorial representation. Again, keeping things basic, Wollheim posited that interpretation and observation were happening simultaneously, especially in representational art. If none of this makes sense just yet, let's create a more tangible example, using a painting by Caspar David Friedrich titled The Lonely Tree. Seeing that emphasizes the recognition of certain aspects or facts within the artwork. In the context of The Lonely Tree, this would involve observing concrete details, such as the texture of the bark, the play of the overcast light and shadows on the leaves, the muted colors, or the overall composition. It points to a more objective appreciation of what is present in the image, focusing on visual characteristics rather than emotional or metaphorical interpretations. Seeing as involves interpreting the painting in a particular context or framework. One might see the tree as a metaphor for resilience, viewing the tree as representative of endurance in the face of adversity. This perspective invites viewers to project broader narratives or comparisons onto the tree, shaping their understanding of the work through specific lenses. Seeing in is a more layered approach to perception and continuous contemplative engagement. We're not simply toggling perspectives as in seeing as, but rather simultaneously aware of all aspects of the painting. We know that this is a representation of a tree, can observe the physical medium and the brushstrokes, and can consider the arrangement of elements or the choice of palette and tones within the painting, which might give it a symbolic meaning. Of course, this isn't a complete view, and we could refine our perception of media even further with another entry. To complete our list, we can look to a contribution from Maurice Merleau-Ponty. In his work Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty explored how perception is an embodied relational experience, which has since been deemed seeing with. Seeing with refers to a way of seeing the world that is inherently connected to our bodies and consciousness. It emphasizes that our perception is not merely a passive reception of stimuli, but is deeply shaped by our bodily experiences, social context, and lived interactions. In the case of the rabbit duck, you might be more inclined to see the rabbit around Easter, or the duck around Christmas. Or if you have a preference to birds over mammals, maybe the duck stuck out right away. Conversely, a rabbit as a childhood pet may cause you to recognize the rabbit first. In the context of our tree example, seeing with posits that our viewing of the painting depicting a tree incorporates our own experiences of trees and any subject related to a tree. You may have nostalgic memories of climbing a tree as a child, or maybe you associate trees with tranquility due to a personal experience. These factors might influence your understanding of the painting and your reaction to it, which may have nothing to do with the artist's intention or anything in the painting. When it comes to contemplating or analyzing media, these are all filters that we are either actively or passively engaged in, and they're worth at least attempting to be cognizant of when we draw conclusions about a work and its meaning. We can see the same lenses applied to readings of The Thing. While none of these is right or wrong, the varied approaches explain why there are so many disparate opinions about what happens in the film and what it means. As we've discussed, seeing that involves recognizing factual elements or straightforward observations about the film. In The Thing, this would include observing what is explicitly shown on screen without deeper interpretation. For example, seeing that this setting is in an isolated Antarctic research station, the jobs each of the characters has, or that the alien organism can perfectly imitate other life forms. We can also observe the sequential plot points and chart the discovery of an alien life form that infiltrates the station and imitates the crew. Seeing that focuses on directly acknowledging the film's visual and narrative details without interpreting or analyzing their meaning. Seeing as involves interpreting what is shown in the film and applying a particular framework or understanding. In the context of The Thing, this could involve different interpretations of not just scenes or characters, but of the film itself. A popular interpretation is the alien as an embodiment of Cold War paranoia. One might see the alien as a metaphor for the fear of infiltration. The fact that the creature mimics humans perfectly can be interpreted as a representation of the fear that anyone could be a foreign agent or an imposter, mirroring anxieties prevalent in 1980s America. Seeing as could also apply to how we view characters. For example, we could interpret Kurt Russell's character MacReady as a representation of rugged individualism facing the unknown. Seeing as engages with the film's themes and invites interpretations that give the film deeper significance beyond its surface narrative. Seeing in applies specifically to representational aspects that could be used to discuss how certain images in the film are perceived both in their literal form and for what they depict. This dual perception is particularly crucial in horror. When the team discovers the grotesquely fused and charred bodies outside the Norwegian camp, viewers see in this visual both the physical, practical effects of the makeup, sculpting, and prosthetics, and the deeper, unsettling implications of what the corpses represent. The fused bodies are not just burned remnants. They can symbolize the horrifying merging of identities and loss of individuality. This image serves as a reminder of the alien's ability to blur the lines between self and other, reinforcing the theme of identity erasure and assimilation. Or consider the helicopter chase at the beginning. On a strictly narrative level, this is a straightforward depiction of an aerial pursuit. However, seeing in this moment includes recognizing it as a tool of foreshadowing and irony. The audience may perceive the Norwegians as frantic figures trying to prevent some looming catastrophe, or may sympathize with the alarm by characters at the American station, who regard them as irrational and aggressive. But in killing the Norwegians and unwittingly saving the Thing, the outpost crew has effectively doomed themselves. This embodies the themes of ignorance and paranoia, setting up the film's underlying thread of mistrust among characters. We can recognize that the writer and director are communicating to us on a meta or structural level, beyond the simple action of the scene. This concept highlights how we can simultaneously appreciate the film's forms of artistry, structure, and craftsmanship, while immersed in its terrifying narrative content. Seeing with involves perceiving the film in an embodied, subjective way, taking into account how viewers' emotions, experiences, and context affect their understanding. For example, we all have shared experiences of fear, so seeing with involves experiencing the film not just as an observer, but by identifying with the character's growing fear and distrust. Viewers can empathize with the crew's paranoia, putting themselves in their shoes, and feeling the claustrophobia and terror of not knowing who to trust. Likewise, viewers might relate the movie to their own experiences of suspicion and anxiety, adding a personal dimension to how they perceive the story and its implications. This makes the horror more immersive and impactful, because it connects with the viewer's sense of vulnerability and the fear of the unknown. There's also contextual resonance. Depending on a viewer's background, the film might bring up different associations, such as relating its themes of infection and hidden threats to modern anxieties of viruses or pandemics, making the film resonate differently in contemporary times. Seeing With emphasizes an emotionally resonant engagement, where the viewer's subjective experiences shape how they understand and feel about the film. So let's return to where we started. Why do we all view the thing's ending so differently? Many of the analyses I've watched rely on the observable or empirical. These viewers are looking strictly for elements that are diegetic, drawing from plot beats and in-camera elements to formulate a solution. They're looking at the content as presented, attempting to arrange these plot elements like pieces to a puzzle. We could tie this most closely to a version of Seeing That. My baseline was different. I took a wider perspective, not only looking at plot elements, but also looking at the application of and purpose behind visual, thematic, or narrative elements that provided a deeper core framework. My conclusion was drawn from a more meta level, matching plot beats to thematic overtures. This corresponds more closely to Seeing In. So where others found an answer strictly in story elements, I found clues in the story structure. And this isn't to say one perceptive application is preferable to another, or that there's always a clear delineation between them. Still, it does reveal how the types of methodologies we use inform how we react to and understand media. You probably do all of this unconsciously, and may not use the same method of seeing each time you watch media. I know that sometimes I watch strictly for the surface details, and then return to a piece later to drill down further. Other times, I might be more plugged in and recognize symbolic elements or motifs as I'm watching. And knowing what filters we watch with or favor subsequently gives us an indication of our interpretive blind spots. Humans have what's called a blind spot in their vision, a place where the optic nerve passes through the optic disc. But we don't perceive it as a dark spot. Instead, our brains interpolate data and fill in that spot based on surrounding detail. Interestingly, when presented with two options, one fully detailed and one that our minds fill in, we'll select the ones our brains filled in as the most accurate. We can observe a similar cognitive approach in how people engage with ambiguous media, and media analysis in general. I love the thing because it exposes us to our metaphorical blind spots. Reflect for a minute on how sure you were the first time you came up with a theory. Did it feel like it just snapped into place? Did it seem obvious to you? Were you confused why others didn't see it the way you did? In truth, we don't know any more than the crew does, and every theory or consideration is based on perception, cognitive bias, memory, and the ways we filter content. Like the crew, every angle seems right, until it's wrong, and we never have quite enough information, even though we think we have things figured out. Each of the methods of seeing we discussed comes with unique reliability issues, which we'll touch on briefly. Seeing That requires that we take proper notice of observable facts. If we miss something or don't recognize its importance, then we run the risk of compromising our experience and analysis. Even though this approach tries to be objective, our minds and bodies gather data subjectively. To use an extreme example, a colorblind person may not see movies the same way a person with a higher range of color perception does, which may impact their experience. In some cases, movies are made to be seen a certain way, and deviating from that format might also impact perception. Barrett Kaufman released a video that points out a similar issue in viewings of Wicked, where the film's poorly received coloring looked better in a Dolby Cinema environment. Seeing as can lead to a limited or one-dimensional media interpretation. By focusing on what an artwork or film can be seen as, we choose a primary metaphor or symbolic meaning at the expense of other potential interpretations. This can reduce the complexity of a piece and overlook additional layers of meaning that could be equally relevant. For instance, if a film is interpreted solely as a commentary on political themes, its artistic, emotional, or psychological dimensions might be neglected or oversimplified. Seeing as and seeing with also have a similar overlap in their issues, as it often relies on the viewer applying their own cultural, personal, or theoretical perspectives to the interpretation. This can result in analyses that are more reflective of the critic's own beliefs or biases than of the artwork itself. For example, interpreting a film as a critique of a certain social issue might say more about the critic's worldview than the director's intentions. Critics may also attempt to apply modern ideas to a work created in a different time or region, with different cultural standards and sensibilities. This can lead to interpretations that, while potentially insightful, may distort or misrepresent the original context or intent of the piece, rendering it fairly useless in a discussion about the art. Seeing in also poses interpretive pitfalls. This multidimensional awareness can allow for more complex analysis. However, it requires balancing technical observation with thematic interpretation, and different viewers might emphasize certain aspects over others. And this subjectivity can lead to varied and potentially conflicting analyses. The flexibility provided by seeing in can also lead to the temptation of overinterpreting media, where viewers might read too much into the technical elements or attribute excessive symbolic significance to them. In other words, sometimes the curtains are just blue. This risk means that interpretations could stray far from the creator's intent or the context of the work, leading to analyses that may feel disconnected from the piece itself. This can result in a focus that prioritizes subjective impressions over more grounded, evidence-based interpretations, or those that neglect to consider the creator's background, historical context, or established critical frameworks. We can see these interpretive pitfalls and blind spots in examinations of the thing as well. To use an example from the film, a commonly cited reason for Mac to be the thing is that the crew should have avoided sharing food for fear of contamination, and that a single molecule might cause assimilation. As a result, his handing Childs a drink is interpreted as the thing attempting to infect Childs as well. But this theory was a precaution from Fuchs, not a rule, and never explicitly confirmed. The only time we witness any assimilation is from some form of more direct contact, and at least appeared to require intention from the thing. Additionally, Blair, despite wearing gloves, is actively touching the corpse of the thing with his arms during the examination. However, he shows no signs of transformation immediately, and even goes as far as attempting to prevent the thing from escaping the base, at least ostensibly. To use molecular contamination as the basis for why Mac is the thing demonstrates how someone can selectively filter information to arrive at an answer, while failing to recognize or ignoring elements that may not support their thesis. Or take another example. When was Blair infected? Typically, it's accepted that this happens after he was isolated from the others outside in the toolshed. But how certain can we be of that? After all, he examined the remains of the thing alone for an extended period of time. We don't know what happened to Blair's body. And if the theories of molecular contamination are right, then for all we know, Blair, who was doing a fair amount of poking around during the autopsy, might have accidentally become infected. In that case, his mental breakdown comes post-infection, as he's potentially aware that he's slowly transforming, making him erratic. His distress over the thing after his exposure, then, stems from the fear of what is about to happen to him. He knows he's doomed and is projecting that fear outwards and attempts to prevent it from happening to anyone else. Now, most would point to the noose that we see in an ominous but darkly comical way hanging in the background of the shed to suggest that Blair was human and considering suicide before being overtaken. And I'm largely in agreement. After all, it would be strange for the thing to pass the time by brushing up on knots. And Blair was becoming increasingly reckless, even to the point of his own safety being in jeopardy. However, others argue it was while inspecting the body, and others still argue that he was infected by the dog. Regardless, it's hard to construct a definitive timeline. I've even seen it posited that Blair was already the thing when destroying the radios, or was at least well on his way to transforming. This theory and its permutations suggest that destroying the machines was potentially the thing's attempt to gain parts and prevent the humans radioing for help, as well as to get put in isolation to begin working on its craft. The same logic is used to support Blair's killing the dogs as a way of removing any creatures who could detect the thing. Now, I hadn't considered that, but it is an interesting angle. However, I think its speculation is a little too elaborate and fanciful, and takes some liberties not intended by the film's context. It also requires changing or ignoring some of the film's contiguity. For example, do we now have to reinterpret this scene to be the thing running a simulation regarding infection rate? Does this mean that it's satisfied with the results? And I guess it knew that Blair had a revolver in the desk. Further, this requires massive foresight and is a tremendous gamble on the creature's part, to be able to surmise that the humans would simply try to contain or isolate Blair rather than just shoot him in self-defense, especially because it just witnessed them shoot another human a few hours earlier over a simple misunderstanding. But to look at it the other way, this theory is supported by the thing choosing to disable the helicopters and steal parts, rather than attempting to pilot the helicopter to escape. Of course, then some might counter that the thing didn't have the knowledge to operate a helicopter but could recognize what parts would be useful in creating its own craft, and the spiral could continue. Regardless of what angle you prefer, it highlights how we filter content in favor of an end goal, because when you think about it, the spacecraft was well underway when MacReady sees it, and if you were looking to explain that, coupled with the passageway under the place Blair was kept, you could find ways to twist narrative elements to satisfy that question. And on the subject of characters, while we're talking about Blair, and everyone is arguing about Childs and MacReady, we don't know what happened to Knowles. He simply never appears again. His fate is left ambiguous as well. Did he survive? Is he dead? Assimilated? Who knows? We also see interpretations that are based on technical, production, or continuity errors. For example, the lack of breath in the cold is often used as a sign that Childs is the thing. However, it's more likely that this is the result of a lighting problem, especially since a previous encounter with the thing sees that it does have breath in the cold. A widely cited reason for Blair's infection was that he touched his pencil eraser to the corpse of the partially assimilated dog things, then to his mouth. This sounds compelling at first, but it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. First, Carpenter has stated that this was simply a mistake on the part of Brimley and was not in the script, making it an editing oversight. But even without that admission from Carpenter, Blair never actually touches the pencil to the corpse. You can still see the shadow of the pencil and the actor's hand moving the pencil as it hovers above the area he's pointing to. As a result, both a technical mistake and an unfortunate camera angle fueled plenty of erroneous speculation. Extrapolating, we see the same thing when it comes to theory crafting about media in general. Selectively filtering information can result in logical leaps unsupported by context, and instead, eisegetical interpretation runs rampant. Individuals start with a conclusion and work backward, attempting to retrofit the selected media to their idea rather than the source, or, conversely, take a piece of information and run with it at the expense of contradictory information. The result is this endless spiral of unfalsifiable proclamations where every opinion and interpretation is deemed equally valid. Eisegesis in media analysis poses significant dangers, as it can lead to unfounded interpretations. As theories become more elaborate, or at least less grounded in the core of the film, they ultimately undermine the film. Because of our mental blind spots, we're more likely to be subject to confirmation bias, to the point of insisting our interpretation is the correct one, even in the face of the contrary. Arguably, this is another of the pitfalls of the interpretive lenses, because your lens may not be an appropriate filter when engaging with another artist's work, especially if your understanding of a piece of media requires reading in elements not present in the art, contradicting core facts, or if it relies on unsubstantiated inference. Bad analysis tends to come from both willful and accidental misreadings. It's one thing to get a fact or two wrong, but some critics take such massive liberties with what is presented, they may as well have not even seen the film at all. I mentioned earlier that I wasn't totally convinced of my own argument, and that's because it has gradually changed over time. When I first saw the thing, I was positive that MacReady was human, and strongly believed that Childs was the thing. And while I do like my theory, I also can't ignore that I probably have some subtle influences on my perspective. For example, there's the non-diegetic conceit that MacReady is the only real point of view character, and I'm more attached to him than the others. I also like Big Trouble in Little China and Escape from New York, so I'm likely predisposed to presume Kurt Russell's characters are considered heroes. However, as I've gotten older and gained greater life experience, I've become more aware of how we can turn on each other in crisis. As a result, I'm now more inclined to believe that neither man is the thing. I laid out a theory earlier using my version of Seeing In, and I can do the same utilizing this potential ending and a complementary thematic framework. Let's examine. The Thing is a masterstroke in storytelling. Carpenter sets seeds for growing paranoia throughout the film. From the moment the Norwegians arrive, the characters begin to unravel, and suspicion and hostility increase. And while each confrontation marks a successive wider arc on the crew's spiral out of control, the entire thematic concept comes to a head in this one vignette. MacReady, sitting alone with his tape recorder, making what might be his final recording, documents the bleak situation and the dwindling resolve of the crew.
Nobody trusts anybody now. We're all very tired.
This is the underpinning of the entire film, that when our trust is gone, so is our hope. We see this echoed in the ending. Childs and MacReady sit in the darkness, unsure of what is real and who they can trust. They may very well have defeated the Thing, but they'll still die, in part because they can no longer work together, broken by the trauma of their experience and perspective. At the end of his soliloquy, MacReady rewinds the tape and does a more formal sign-off, effectively erasing this moment of frailty and humanity, and with it, a part of the truth of the situation. Likewise, the truth of whatever happened here at the outpost will be lost with Childs and MacReady. We even see a similar thematic echo from the beginning return. When the Norwegians arrived, they were frantic and pushed to their limits, and the urgency of their situation, coupled with a language barrier, resulted in a fatal misunderstanding. The truth died with the Norwegians as well, and all because trust could not be established. And when the Americans investigated their base, we see a grim foreshadowing of what is to come: complete desolation and mangled corpses, along with data in bits and fragments that do not illustrate a complete picture until it's too late. This foreshadowing leaves us to wonder what a recovery crew will find when they investigate Outpost 31. The ending is even more ominous than the beginning. Though the demise of the Norwegian crew in Outpost 31 is the same, the final Norwegians perish in bright daylight, but the plight of Outpost 31 ends in total darkness. Once more, I'm using thematic cues as my guide and then pairing them with plot elements, but I'm also pairing it with seeing with, allowing some of my own experience to influence my reading. We all use at least one of these filters and maybe several in conjunction. You may also use some more nuanced ones that I didn't mention here. Take a minute and think about how you interact with the film. Which ways of seeing do you favor the most, and how do you think that has impacted your appreciation of what's happening? One of the values of seeing in, for me as a perceptive approach, and why I tend to favor it, is that it also incorporates the hand of the artist. Seeing in permits us to be cognizant of artistic choices, rather than just plot elements or by attempting to assign value. We can ask ourselves what an artist is attempting to communicate with their choices in telling their story. As a result, it also permits us to sidestep some of the less savory aspects of seeing as or seeing with. Volheim addresses this in a later part of Essay 5 when he talks about a standard of correctness. Effectively, although interpreting art involves some degree of subjectivity, there is still a criterion for determining whether a given interpretation is reasonable or aligned with the artist's intention or the artwork's inherent qualities. Volheim argues broadly that the standard of correctness relies on a reading having several key elements. The first is interpretive support, that is, a reading is supported by the visual or structural elements of a work. This means that the interpretation should resonate with what can be seen or inferred from the piece itself, rather than being purely speculative or contextually disjointed. A slightly trickier needle to thread, Volheim acknowledged that understanding the artist's intention or the historical context of the artwork could enrich interpretation and be a helpful supplemental aid, while maintaining that ultimately, the artwork must stand as an independent object of analysis. Interpretation should emerge from the interaction between the viewer and the piece. Still, Volheim believed that an interpretation rooted in the context of creation respects the work's inherent qualities, and a completely ahistorical interpretation, detached from its context, might not fully respect the piece's origin or deeper significance. We also have to maintain a balance between objectivity and subjectivity. We can have multiple interpretations, so long as they remain within the boundaries set by the artwork's properties. We should attempt to maintain a balance between our subjective responses and an objective assessment that respects the integrity of the work. While Carpenter may not have intended for us to have a correct ending, or at least not an apparent one, he did intend for us to see certain motifs and themes within the film, in particular, a meditation on apocalypse. Even without Carpenter weighing in on this subject, the idea that the thing is effectively an unstoppable force that humans would be powerless against is palpable. His creative choices are all in service of creating a bleak atmosphere filled with paranoia, distrust, violence, and terror beyond our comprehension. The thing represents a threat to us on an existential level. It's not just that it can kill us, it's that it can overtake and imitate us, threatening our very identities and individuality. The alien is not nearly as terrifying as its implications. On the one hand, we have a story where the unknown, that is, those things beyond our awareness, our comprehension, or our ability to contend with, are waiting to destroy us, and we are hopelessly outmatched, both in our frailty and ignorance. On the other hand, we have a story about a man who is the last line of defense against a potential global annihilation, the only person who knows the truth, and who could be key to saving the planet, but will not survive to share what little knowledge he has. And on the third hand, which, given the whole shape-shifting alien thing feels appropriate, we have a story where two men, despite being allied against a common enemy, are gradually broken down in the face of fear and the pressure of continued onslaught, unable to overcome their paranoia and no longer able to trust their senses, finally turned against the only people they could trust to begin with. And this is just 3 of a multitude of ways to view this through an apocalyptic lens. Regardless of the angle, we return to Carpenter's thematic overture, a contemplation of the end of the world. Within, the personal is global, Outpost 31 serving as a microcosmic metaphor for larger and larger communities, and ultimately, giving a grim reflection of humanity and our place in the universe. A question to ask when reflecting on the film is, what does apocalypse look like? Is it man alone with a truth that can't help him? Is it man in the face of insurmountable odds? Is it man turned against himself, unable to trust or work together? Or is it man completely ignorant of the things which wait to destroy him? When you think about the thing, it's not the alien that's the most frightening. After all, the alien is a tangible, ostensibly mortal threat. What's truly frightening is the not knowing. It's the sudden realization that the universe is so much bigger than the niche we have for ourselves. We're MacReady playing against the chess wizard. Just when we think we have it figured out, there's something we didn't consider. And that blind spot could do us in. As much as I enjoy watching people make their case for who is or isn't the thing, and I hope it continues, it does become tedious when you realize people become too caught up in looking for an answer when there isn't one. And while it's fine to have our own pet theories, it's also important to ensure they don't override the purpose of the art we're viewing, or that our attention doesn't become so narrowly focused on something like the ending that we cheat ourselves of a more layered and wider appreciation of the film as a whole. Knowing who the thing is would drastically alter our understanding of the film because it would remove the artfully crafted discomfort. I think that if John Carpenter ever told us the truth about the ending, I probably wouldn't want to know, and might even go to great lengths to avoid his answer. The thing's ambiguity is integral to its artistic success. And not because great art makes you think or challenges you, which are 2 overused aphorisms invoked to run cover for bad art as often as it is sincere. The Thing is a hectic, tense, and aggressive narrative that is a perfect amalgamation of its parts. The film strings us along, building our paranoia and fear, drawing to a violent head as the action continues to build before literally exploding. And then, nothing. There's stillness as the whole world is quietly burning down. All that noise and tension resolves in an eerily calm denouement. There are no answers. There is no clear resolution. Just 2 characters sitting and waiting in a black uncertainty. To pull the threads in any one direction, to add or subtract in any way, or to recontextualize by adding greater certainty, would diminish its gravity and its effectiveness. The Thing isn't just captivating because we're still discussing the ending all these decades later, but because of how much we're required to discuss in order to appreciate the film, and subsequently its ending, properly. And like the titular character, the film and our relationship with it continue to evolve. Now, maybe none of this changes how you feel about your interpretation of the Thing, but hopefully it gives you something to think about the next time you watch The Thing or engage with any other media. Take note not just of what you observe, but ask yourself, what do those things mean? And do they really mean that, or do they just mean that to you? How much of you do you bring into your interpretation? What do you think the writers or directors meant? Were they successful? Why did they make the choices they made for things like cinematography, special effects, or shot composition? How do their artistic choices impact your ability to relate to what's happening on screen? Ultimately, how you interpret the Thing says more about you than it does about the film. And the bad news is, you're wrong anyway. At the end of the day, the rabbit duck isn't any more or less a rabbit or a duck. Now, if this whole thing sounds way too involved for a simple horror movie, bordering on pretentious and overthinking, yeah, probably. But thanks for listening anyway. If you're here because you were a subscriber before I took a very long hiatus, thanks for sticking around. I'm going to try to post with some more frequency now, and hopefully about subjects you're interested in. If you're here because you got hoodwinked into watching me prattle on about art and philosophy under the guise of The Thing, sorry, but hopefully it was worth your time. If you're interested in any of the subjects I mentioned, I'll include some links below. Richard Volheim's work, which is much more nuanced and complex than what I outlined here, is stellar for anyone looking to enhance their media analysis and understanding of more philosophical aspects of art, so I would definitely recommend picking up Art and Its Objects. And on that note, I should thank Father Bonaventure Chapman from Godsplaining for recommending art and its objects to me, because it was accidentally instrumental in spurring me into finishing this video. Unless you don't believe in accidents, which would make my actually finishing a new video divine intervention. Which is harsh, but fair.